A red line drawn in uranium. Iran's declaration that it will never give up nuclear enrichment is not a throwaway diplomatic phrase. It is a red line, drawn deliberately, publicly, and repeatedly, at a moment when U.S. Iran talks are once again grinding forward under immense pressure. To understand why this statement matters so much, this is not just about centrifuges and percentages. It is about sovereignty, survival, history, and the limits of diplomacy in a world where trust has been burned away. At the heart of the current talks lies a contradiction that has haunted U.S.-Iran relations for decades. Tehran wants recognition of what it sees as its legitimate right, under international law, to enrich uranium for civilian purposes. For the United States, enrichment capability equals potential weaponization. Iranian officials have been unambiguous. From the president to the foreign minister, Tehran's message is consistent. Enrichment is non-negotiable, not suspended, not outsourced, not frozen indefinitely, never abandoned. This stance is not new, but its timing is critical, and U.S. military assets are visibly present in the Middle East. Iran's message is aimed not just at Washington, but at its own population, its regional rivals, and the broader international community. To Iran, nuclear enrichment is framed as a symbol of technological progress and national dignity. Iranian leaders often compare their nuclear program to space launches or advanced missile development, proof that the country cannot be kept permanently dependent on foreign powers. Decades of sanctions, sabotage, assassinations of scientists, and cyber attacks have hardened this mindset. In Tehran's view, every concession made under pressure invites further demands. From the U.S. perspective, this reasoning is deeply unsettling. American policymakers remember how close Iran came to weapons-grade enrichment in recent years. They remember hidden facilities, incomplete disclosures, and the slow erosion of inspection regimes. Even if Iran insists its program is peaceful, Washington argues that the technical reality matters more than intent. A country that can enrich uranium at high levels can, if it chooses, cross the nuclear threshold quickly. That is the core fear driving U.S. policy. The talks themselves reflect this mutual suspicion. They are often indirect, conducted through mediators, with carefully scripted statements released to the media. Each side claims progress, while quietly accusing the other of bad faith. Iran demands sanctions relief first, arguing that it will not reverse nuclear steps for promises alone. The United States insists on concrete nuclear limits before lifting pressure. This chicken and egg problem has stalled negotiations repeatedly. Iran's insistence on enrichment also plays to domestic politics. Hardliners within the system view compromise with the United States as dangerous, even humiliating. They point to past agreements that failed to deliver economic relief and argue that the West cannot be trusted. For them, enrichment is not just a policy, it is a line that separates resistance from submission. Even Iranian leaders who favor diplomacy must operate within this political reality. At the same time, Iran's economy remains under strain. Inflation, currency weakness, and limited access to global markets have taken a toll on ordinary citizens. This creates pressure on the government to seek relief through diplomacy. Yet that pressure cuts both ways. If talks collapse and sanctions remain, leaders can blame the United States and rally nationalist sentiment. If Iran appears to retreat on enrichment, critics at home could accuse the government of selling out national interests. The regional dimension complicates matters further. Israel views Iran's enrichment capability as an existential threat, regardless of diplomatic assurances. Gulf Arab states worry about Iran's growing technological and military confidence. Any deal that allows Iran to retain enrichment, even under strict limits, raises alarm bells among U.S. allies. Washington must balance these concerns while trying to prevent escalation into open conflict. Military pressure looms constantly in the background. U.S. officials insist that diplomacy is the preferred path, but also stress that all options remain on the table. Iran, for its part, publicly dismisses military threats, claiming they only strengthen its resolve. This dynamic creates a dangerous feedback loop. The more pressure the U.S. applies, the more Iran frames enrichment as an act of defiance. The more Iran defies, the more Washington doubts diplomacy can work. International law is often cited by both sides, but interpreted very differently. Iran points to the Nuclear Non-Proliferation Treaty, which allows peaceful nuclear energy development. The United States counters that the same treaty obligates transparency and prohibits steps that move toward weaponization. The debate becomes less about legal text and more about trust, and trust is precisely what is missing. History casts a long shadow over the talks. Iran remembers foreign intervention, sanctions, and broken promises. The United States remembers hostage crises, proxy conflicts, and threats against its allies. Each side believes the other has acted aggressively first. This shared sense of grievance makes compromise politically risky and emotionally charged. Iran's declaration that it will never give up enrichment is therefore both a negotiating position and a warning. It signals that Tehran is willing to walk away rather than cross this line. Whether that is a bluff or a genuine endpoint remains unclear. What is clear is that enrichment has become the symbolic core of the dispute, far more than any specific percentage or inspection mechanism. As talks continue, diplomats are left searching for creative solutions, limits on enrichment levels, expanded inspections, or multilateral oversight arrangements. Yet even the most sophisticated technical fixes struggle to overcome the fundamental mistrust between the two sides. Each proposal is scrutinized not just for what it allows, but for what it implies about power, legitimacy, and future leverage. Pressure, power, and the shadow of escalation. As U.S. Iran talks drag on under the weight of Iran's uncompromising stance on nuclear enrichment, the real battle is no longer confined to negotiating tables. It is unfolding across multiple layers of pressure: economic, military, political, and psychological. Each side is attempting to shape the outcome, not just through words, but through leverage. And the more entrenched those pressure tactics become, the harder it is for either side to step back without appearing weak. For the United States, sanctions remain the primary tool of influence. Years of economic restrictions have severely limited Iran's access to international banking, energy markets, and foreign investment. Washington believes these pressures are what brought Iran to the negotiating table in the first place. The logic is simple. Without sanctions relief, Iran's economic pain will deepen, eventually forcing compromise. Yet this strategy has limits. Iran has adapted to isolation, built alternative trade networks, and developed sanctions evasion techniques. Economic pain has not produced surrender. Instead, it has fueled resentment. Iranian leaders frequently argue that sanctions prove the United States is negotiating in bad faith. From Tehran's perspective, how can trust be built when pressure continues even during talks? This belief strengthens hardliners who argue that Iran should expand, not restrict, its nuclear program to force concessions. In this mindset, enrichment becomes a bargaining chip only if it is advanced, not surrendered. The more pressure applied, the more Iran believes it must increase leverage rather than reduce it. Military signaling adds another dangerous dimension. U.S. aircraft carriers, bombers, and missile defense systems in the region are meant to deter Iran from escalation. Publicly, Washington frames these deployments as defensive. Privately, they are reminders of overwhelming force. Iran responds with its own displays: missile tests, drone demonstrations, and military exercises. These actions are carefully calibrated to avoid outright war, but the margin for error is thin. The risk lies not in deliberate conflict, but in miscalculation. A drone shot down, a ship harassed, a proxy clash gone too far. Any of these could spiral rapidly. Iran insists that military threats do not scare it, yet the constant readiness for conflict keeps tensions at a boiling point. Diplomacy conducted under the shadow of force is fragile by nature. One unexpected incident could collapse talks overnight. Regional proxies further complicate the equation. Iran's influence across the Middle East, through aligned militias and political allies, gives it asymmetric power. The United States and its partners view this network as destabilizing. Iran sees it as strategic depth, a deterrent against direct attack. During nuclear talks, any regional flare-up can be interpreted as pressure or provocation, even if unrelated. This interconnected battlefield makes compartmentalized diplomacy nearly impossible. Inside Washington, the debate over Iran is deeply divided. Some policymakers argue that allowing any enrichment capability is unacceptable. Others warn that demanding zero enrichment is unrealistic and guarantees failure. These divisions weaken negotiating coherence. Iran watches U.S. domestic politics closely, aware that election cycles and shifting administrations can undo agreements. This reinforces Tehran's insistence on irreversible red lines rather than flexible compromises. Iran's internal politics are no less complex. While officials present a unified front publicly, there are intense debates behind closed doors. Technocrats worry about economic collapse. Security officials prioritize deterrence. Ideologues frame the nuclear issue as resistance to Western domination. Any deal must satisfy all these factions, or risk collapse from within. The insistence on enrichment is one of the few positions that unites them. Trust, once broken, is difficult to rebuild. The collapse of earlier agreements left deep scars. Iran argues that it complied while the United States withdrew and reimposed sanctions. The U.S. counters that Iran exploited loopholes and escalated enrichment afterward. Each side feels betrayed. Negotiators now operate in an environment where promises are discounted and verification becomes everything. This is why inspections and monitoring dominate technical discussions. The United States wants intrusive oversight. Iran demands respect for sovereignty. Every camera, every inspector visit, every data request becomes a political issue. Iran fears inspections could be used for intelligence gathering or future sabotage. The U.S. fears that limited access hides dangerous advances. The result is endless wrangling over details that mask a deeper problem. Neither side fully trusts the other's intentions. Meanwhile, time itself is a strategic factor. Iran's nuclear knowledge cannot be erased. Even if facilities were dismantled, expertise remains. This reality shifts calculations in Tehran's favor. Delays in negotiations do not necessarily weaken Iran's position, they may strengthen it. The U.S. understands this, which increases urgency, but urgency can also lead to bad deals or hard ultimatums. International actors try to fill the gaps. European states push for compromise, fearing regional war and nuclear proliferation. Russia and China support Iran diplomatically, while leveraging the standoff for their own strategic advantage. This multipolar dynamic reduces U.S. leverage and gives Iran alternatives, however limited. Negotiations are no longer bilateral in effect, even if they appear so on paper. Iran's statement that it will never abandon enrichment should also be read as a message to these global players. Tehran is signaling that any agreement must work within that boundary. It is an attempt to redefine what realistic diplomacy looks like. Whether the United States accepts this reframing will determine the talks' future. If negotiations fail, several paths emerge, and none are reassuring. Iran could further expand enrichment, shortening breakout time. The U.S. could tighten sanctions and increase isolation. Regional tensions could intensify, raising the risk of confrontation. Each step increases the stakes and narrows options. The longer this cycle continues, the harder it becomes to reverse. Yet, failure is not inevitable. Diplomacy often advances slowly through partial steps and uncomfortable compromises. History shows that even bitter rivals can reach agreements when costs outweigh benefits. The question is whether both Washington and Tehran believe that moment has arrived, or whether they still think pressure will force the other to blink first. Red lines, realities, and the limits of diplomacy. By the time negotiations reach this stage, the focus is no longer on optimism, but on endurance. U.S.-Iran talks continue, not because either side is confident of success, but because the alternatives are far worse. Iran's unwavering insistence on maintaining nuclear enrichment has transformed diplomacy into a test of realism. The question is no longer whether Iran will give up enrichment. It is made clear that it will not, but whether the international system can adapt to that reality without sliding into conflict. For the United States, accepting Iran's enrichment capability feels dangerously close to legitimizing a path toward nuclear weapons. Washington has long argued that preventing the spread of enrichment technology is essential to global security. Iran challenges that logic directly. It claims that enrichment itself is not the problem. Misuse is. From Tehran's perspective, denying enrichment is collective punishment, not non-proliferation. This clash exposes a structural flaw in the global nuclear order. Countries with enrichment capability are trusted because they are powerful and allied with the West. Countries outside that circle are viewed with suspicion, regardless of legal rights. Iran frames this as hypocrisy. Its leaders ask why some states can possess thousands of nuclear warheads while Iran is denied even civilian enrichment. This argument resonates domestically and across parts of the developing world. Diplomats attempt to bridge this gap with technical solutions. Caps on enrichment levels, limits on centrifuge numbers, stockpile reductions, and real-time monitoring. On paper, these measures reduce risk. In practice, they depend entirely on trust and political will. Iran worries that temporary limits become permanent constraints. The U.S. worries that temporary compliance masks long-term ambition. Each side views the same mechanism through opposite lenses. The concept of breakout time has become central to negotiations. U.S. officials want enough distance between Iran's civilian program and weaponization to allow detection and response. Iran sees this as an artificial construct designed to limit its scientific progress. Tehran argues that no other NPT signatory is subjected to such standards. This debate illustrates how technical language often conceals political judgment. Iran's refusal to abandon enrichment is also tied to lessons learned from past vulnerability. Before its nuclear advances, Iran relied heavily on foreign suppliers for fuel. Disruptions and political pressure convinced leaders that dependency was a strategic weakness. Enrichment, in their view, is insurance. Surrendering it would mean trusting external powers not to exploit Iran again, a trust Tehran does not possess. Meanwhile, the U.S. faces its own credibility problem. Allies question whether Washington can enforce red lines or sustain long-term commitments. Rivals test its resolve. Any deal with Iran must demonstrate firmness without provoking escalation. This balancing act is becoming harder as global power shifts and domestic polarization intensifies. Iran understands this and calibrates its stance accordingly. Public messaging plays a critical role. Iranian officials speak in absolutes, never, under any circumstances, even if war is imposed. These words are not accidental. They are designed to lock in positions, reduce room for domestic backlash, and signal resolve externally. For negotiators, such rhetoric limits flexibility. Walking back from absolutes risks political damage at home. Yet diplomacy often succeeds not by eliminating red lines, but by redefining what lies behind them. Iran's red line is enrichment itself, not necessarily its scope. This leaves a narrow opening for compromise. The U.S. may not get zero enrichment, but it could aim for strict constraints that make weaponization politically and technically costly. Whether this is acceptable depends on how success is defined. Failure, however, carries its own momentum. If talks collapse, Iran is likely to accelerate enrichment further, arguing that diplomacy has failed. The U.S. would respond with increased sanctions and isolation. Over time, these steps harden positions and normalize escalation. What once seemed unthinkable becomes routine. The danger is not sudden war, but gradual slide toward confrontation. The role of international inspectors becomes increasingly fraught in this environment. Their presence is meant to reassure, yet it also symbolizes intrusion. Iran has previously reduced cooperation when under pressure, using access as leverage. The U.S. sees this as proof that Iran cannot be trusted. Iran sees it as a response to coercion. This cycle erodes the very mechanisms designed to prevent crisis. Strategic patience is often cited as a virtue, but patience without progress can become paralysis. Years of stalled talks risk entrenching a status quo where Iran advances its program incrementally while avoiding outright violations that would justify military action. This gray zone favors Iran, but it also increases uncertainty. The longer ambiguity persists, the greater the chance of misinterpretation. Iran's regional behavior further complicates negotiations. While Tehran insists the nuclear issue should be isolated, the U.S. and its allies disagree. Missile development, proxy networks, and regional influence all shape threat perceptions. Iran resists linking these issues, fearing a never-ending list of demands. The result is fragmented diplomacy, where solving one problem does not resolve the broader conflict. At a deeper level, the talks reflect a clash of worldviews. Iran sees itself as a revolutionary state resisting dominance. The U.S. sees itself as a guarantor of international order. Each believes compromise risks undermining its identity. This makes technical agreements fragile unless accompanied by a broader shift in relations, something neither side currently trusts enough to pursue fully. As negotiations continue, both sides face diminishing returns. The political cost of concession rises, while the benefits become uncertain. This is often the moment when diplomacy either breaks or surprises. History shows that breakthroughs sometimes occur when stalemate becomes unbearable. Whether Washington and Tehran have reached that point remains unclear. Navigating the edge, resolution, risks, and the future. As the U.S.-Iran negotiations advance into increasingly tense stages, it has become evident that the nuclear issue is about far more than uranium and centrifuges. It is a story of national identity, historical grievances, strategic calculation, and the precarious balance of international diplomacy. In this final chapter, the stakes of the talks, the risks of failure, and the narrow avenues for potential compromise all come sharply into focus. For both Iran and the United States, every move is weighted by consequences that extend far beyond the negotiating table. Iran's red line on nuclear enrichment has transformed from a technical detail into a core pillar of its national policy. Officials in Tehran stress that enrichment is not optional. It is a manifestation of sovereignty and self-determination. While the international community views this capability as a potential stepping stone to weaponization, Iranian leaders argue that denying enrichment is an arbitrary constraint imposed by powerful nations. In their view, conceding on this point would not simply weaken Iran's negotiating position. It would constitute a symbolic surrender that could embolden external actors to push for further concessions in the future. From Washington's perspective, accepting Iran's enrichment program presents a complex dilemma. On the one hand, a complete shutdown is unrealistic, given Iran's entrenched political consensus and technical capabilities. On the other hand, allowing enrichment, even under strict oversight, risks undermining non-proliferation norms and sending a signal to other countries that acquiring nuclear know-how can be done without accountability. U.S. policymakers are thus walking a tightrope, attempting to balance the imperatives of security, credibility, and diplomatic viability. One of the most challenging elements of these talks is the inherent asymmetry of trust. Decades of hostility have left both sides deeply skeptical of the other's intentions. Past agreements have been broken, sanctions reimposed, and covert operations conducted, all contributing to a mutual perception of bad faith. This lack of trust has transformed what could be a purely technical negotiation into a complex psychological struggle where rhetoric, symbolism, and perception often carry as much weight as legal provisions or inspection protocols. The broader Middle Eastern context compounds the difficulty. Regional rivals, such as Israel and Gulf Arab states, exert intense pressure on the United States to prevent any concessions that might enhance Iran's strategic leverage. Tehran, in turn, leverages these fears to strengthen its bargaining position, arguing that its nuclear program is a defensive necessity. Proxy conflicts and missile developments are intertwined with these negotiations, creating a dynamic in which every military maneuver, test launch, or show of force has implications for the diplomatic process. In other words, the negotiation is never isolated. It exists within a theater of continual strategic signaling. Economic considerations further complicate the scenario. Iran faces significant economic strain due to sanctions, currency depreciation, and trade limitations. While these pressures push Tehran toward negotiation, they also strengthen the argument of hardliners who assert that giving up enrichment under duress is unacceptable. The interplay between internal economic reality and domestic political narratives creates a precarious environment in which every concession must be weighed not only against international pressures, but also against potential political backlash at home. Within Washington, the challenge is equally daunting. Policymakers must reconcile competing demands, pressure from allies, domestic political considerations, and the imperative of preventing nuclear proliferation. The debate is not purely ideological, but profoundly practical. How to achieve a sustainable, verifiable arrangement that mitigates risks while acknowledging geopolitical realities. This balancing act is rendered even more complex by the fragmented nature of U.S. politics, where shifts in policy can occur with changes in administration or congressional priorities, adding layers of uncertainty to the negotiating process. Technological realities also shape the terms of engagement. Iran has developed significant nuclear expertise and infrastructure, which cannot be undone instantly. Any compromise must account for the persistence of knowledge and capabilities, making verification and monitoring essential components of any agreement. Real-time inspections, limitations on centrifuge numbers, and strict reporting mechanisms are tools designed to manage these risks, but their effectiveness depends on consistent compliance and mutual recognition of enforcement authority. At the same time, the psychological dimension of negotiation cannot be overstated. Each public statement, each press briefing, each diplomatic communique contributes to the perception of resolve. Iran's repeated insistence on maintaining enrichment is not merely a policy statement. It is a message to multiple audiences, domestic constituencies, regional rivals, global powers, and even future generations of negotiators. The U.S., conversely, must project both firmness and openness, a delicate combination intended to signal that, while compromise is possible, unacceptable steps will provoke consequences. Given these constraints, the potential paths forward are narrow but not non-existent. A successful outcome would likely involve a carefully calibrated agreement that recognizes Iran's right to a limited enrichment program under rigorous oversight, while simultaneously providing sufficient transparency and restrictions to satisfy the concerns of the international community. Sanctions relief, phased over time and contingent on compliance, could serve as both incentive and verification mechanism. Such an approach would require patience, ingenuity, and a degree of political courage on both sides. However, failure remains a very real possibility. Should negotiations collapse, Iran could accelerate enrichment unilaterally, shrinking the so-called breakout time and heightening regional fears. The U.S. could respond with intensified economic and diplomatic pressure, potentially accompanied by military posturing. In the worst-case scenario, miscalculations, accidents, or unintended escalations could ignite direct conflict with consequences that extend far beyond the immediate actors. Despite these risks, diplomacy continues because the alternatives are far worse. The pursuit of a negotiated outcome, even if imperfect, offers a framework for stability, transparency, and risk management. In many ways, the ongoing talks are less about producing immediate solutions than about preserving the possibility of incremental progress. They are a recognition that even in an environment of deep mistrust, dialogue remains preferable to confrontation. The broader lesson from these negotiations is that nuclear diplomacy is inseparable from broader, strategic, political, and historical contexts. It is never simply about technical constraints or verification protocols. Every policy decision reverberates through domestic politics, regional alliances, and global perceptions. Negotiators must navigate this multidimensional landscape with care, aware that missteps can have consequences far beyond the immediate stakes of uranium enrichment. As Part 4 of this narrative draws to a close, one reality stands out. Iran's insistence on maintaining nuclear enrichment is both a challenge and a defining feature of the contemporary geopolitical landscape. It tests the limits of diplomacy, the resilience of international institutions, and the ability of states to reconcile principles with pragmatism. For the United States, Iran, and their respective partners, the path forward is precarious, contingent on patience, ingenuity, and the willingness to engage with an adversary that refuses to yield on its most sacred red line. In conclusion, the U.S.-Iran nuclear negotiations are emblematic of the complex interplay between power, identity, and survival in international relations. They illustrate how deeply rooted political, historical, and psychological factors can shape the trajectory of diplomacy, and why simple solutions are rarely sufficient. The stakes are enormous, the risks are real, and the world is watching. What happens in the coming months will shape the future not just of U.S.-Iran relations, but of regional security and the norms that govern nuclear nonproliferation globally. If you found this detailed breakdown insightful and want to follow our deep dives into global events like this, don't forget to hit that like button and subscribe to our channel for more updates and analyses.